Chapter 6, Courtly Love, Troubadours, and Cathars. That all European poetry has come out of the Provençal poetry written in the 12th century by the troubadours of Languedoc is now accepted on every side. Let me read that again. And it starts with a star at the top of the passage. That all European poetry has come out of the Provençal poetry written in the 12th century by the troubadours of Languedoc is now accepted on every side. This poetry magnified unhappy love. M. Charles Albert Singrio remarks, between the 11th and 12th centuries, poetry, whether Hungarian or Spanish, Portuguese, German, Sicilian, Tuscan, Genoese, Pisan, Picard, Champagne, Flemish, English, etc., was at first Languedoc, which is to say that the poet who had to be a troubadour, which is to say that the poet who had to be a troubadour was compelled to speak the troubadour language, which was never other than Provençal. The whole of the Occitanian, Petrarchian, and Dantesque lyric has but a single theme, love, and not happy, crowned, and satisfied love, the sight of which yields nothing, but on the contrary, love perpetually unsatisfied, and but two characters, a poet reiterating his plaint 800, 900, 1,000 times, and a fair lady who ever says no. No European poetry has been more profoundly rhetorical, not only in its verbal and musical forms, but also, paradoxical as it may seem, in its actual inspiration, which it obtained from a fixed system of rules, which was codified as the Leis d'Amour. But it is likewise true that no rhetoric has been more productive of high-flown fervor. Let me read the footnote at the bottom. Measures number 2, Paris, 1937. The Provençal mentioned there was in reality the dialect of the county of Toulouse. What it quickens with noble emotion is love outside marriage. For marriage implies no more than a physical union. But amour, the supreme eros, is the transport of the soul upwards to ultimate union with light, something far beyond any love attainable in this life. That is why love now implies chastity. Et d'amour mu castitas, sang the Toulouse troubadour Wilhelm Montenhagel. Out of love comes chastity. Love further implies a ritual, the ritual of damne or danoi, love's vassalage. It is by the beauty of his musical homage that a poet wins his lady. On his knee he swears eternal constancy to her, as knights swore fealty to their suzerain. He receives from her a golden ring and a chaste kiss on his brow. Thereupon the lovers are bound by the rules of courtesia, secrecy, patience, and moderation, the last not being altogether synonymous with chastity, but meaning rather restraint, and especially a man has to be the servant of a woman. Whence came this notion of a love perpetually unsatisfied, and whence, too, that of singing with plaintive enthusiasm the praises of, quote, a fair lady who ever says no, end of quote? And how is it that such consummate poesy was at hand ready to serve the new passion? The miraculous character of the twin birth cannot be too greatly stressed. Within no more than about 20 years, there were established together, on the one hand, a vision of woman entirely at variance with traditional manners. Woman was set above man and became his nostalgic ideal. And on the other hand, a new but fully developed poetry of an extremely complex and refined character. A poetry equally unknown to antiquity and to the few centuries of romantic literary vigor that had followed the Carolingian Renaissance. Either both these things dropped out of the sky, that is to say, medieval society was suddenly and collectively inspired with them, or else they had some definite historical cause. On the first assumption, we must ask why the inspiration came at that particular time and in that particular area. And on the second assumption, why the historical cause should have remained a mystery ever since. The most curious feature of the business is that whenever the most serious authorities happen to refer to it, they betray that they are at a loss and at once determined to say nothing. It is generally recognized today that both provincial poetry and the notion of love which informs its themes, far from being accounted for by conditions prevailing at the time, seem to have been in flat contradiction to them. Evidently, according to M. Jean Roy, footnote number 1, A. Jean Roy, Introduction to Anthologie des Troubadours, Paris, 1927. According to M. Jean Roy, the poetry did not reflect the actual state of affairs, for the position allotted to woman in feudal institutions of the South was quite as lowly and dependent as in those of the North. If it is thus evident that the troubadours were not depicting the conditions around them, they must have obtained their notion of love from elsewhere. The same must be true for that matter of their art, their poetic technique, quote, an extremely original creation, end of quote, M. Jean Roy writes. Notwithstanding that each poet, when he takes them singly, he reproaches with having displayed no originality of any kind and with having merely refined on forms already fixed and commonplaces. Yet one of them at least must have created the forms, yet whenever some historian ventures on a theory of how courtly rhetoric came into being, the authorities turn on him with biting irony. Sismondi attributed the origins of emotional mysticism to the Arabs. His theory was disdainfully rejected as monstrous. Footnote 2, A. Jean Roy. Diaz discerned resemblances in the rhythms and pauses of Arab and provincial lyric poetry. We are told he must not be taken seriously. Brinkman and others suggested that Latin poetry of the 11th and 12th centuries may have provided models. But this, it is said, cannot be listened to because the troubadours, it seems, were not sufficiently educated to have been aware of this poetry. Thus, no matter what explanation is offered, the authorities are apparently determined to pooh-pooh any attempt to give a meaning to what they have devoted their lives to studying. It is true that Wechsler, in a famous book, footnote 3, E. Wechsler, Das Kulturproblem des Minnesangs. Wechsler, in a famous book, supposed everything was going to be cleared up when he announced that he had found underlying provincial poetry certain religious influences. Of a Neoplatonist and debased Christian nature. But he was at once stigmatized. A doctrinaire, the most damaging of insults. And several Frenchmen implied that as he was both a professor and a German, he was hardly fitted to form an opinion on a matter connected with the limpid and elegant genius of southern France. We thus have, on the one hand, a queer historical phenomenon, and on the other hand, very learned refutations of whatever may claim to account for it. One professor writes, to look upon those love songs which form 3/4 of provincial poetry as being a faithful reflection of reality is quite as impossible as to regard them as being a bundle of set phrases devoid of meaning. No doubt. No diggity. But thereupon the professor declares that as, quote, a scrupulous historian, end of quote, he takes care not to commit himself. That amounts to saying that the lyric poetry of courtly love with which he is concerned remains for him, till he learns to the contrary, a bundle of set phrases devoid of meaning. Excellent material, it is true, for a self-respecting philologist who does not intend to force a text, even by means of the least attempt to understand it. For my part, I cannot rest content with such a scrupulous attitude. I cannot believe that the troubadours were so simple as merely to repeat forms picked up anyhow, following E. Hérault and Pelladam, footnote 1, Eugène Hérault, Dante Pastor de l'Église, never mind, I can't read French. Following E. Aroux and Peladan, I wonder if the clue to the secret of all this poetry is not to be sought nearer at hand than any one of us has so far looked for it. Much nearer, on the spot, and in the environment of the poets. I do not mean the purely social environment in the modern sense, but in the religious atmosphere, which happened to determine the formal behavior, including the social usages of that environment. One great historical event stands out in the provincial 12th century simultaneously with the lyrical surge of the Domne, and in the same provinces and among the same classes there also arose a great heresy. Historians have declared that the Catharist religion was as powerful a menace to the Church as Arianism had been earlier. It has even been asserted that notwithstanding the bloody Albigensian Crusade, or on account of it, this religion won millions of secret converts in Europe during the 13th century and afterwards up to the Reformation. Cathar is from Greek, spotless. The exact origin of the heresy can be attributed to the Neo-Manichaean sects of Asia Minor and to the Bogomil churches of Dalmatia and Bulgaria. The pure, or Cathars, were affiliated with the great Gnostic streams that flowed across the first millenary of Christianity. It is well known that the Gnosis, like the doctrine of Mani or Manes, thrust down its roots into the dualist religion of Persia. What was the Catharist doctrine? For a long time it went on being repeated that nobody would ever know, and this for the good reason that the Inquisition had burned all the liturgical books and doctrinal treatises of the heresy, and that the only surviving testimony consisted of the answers of the accused during interrogation. These, however, having probably been extorted by the judges and deformed by the clerks who wrote them down. Actually, the discovery and publication in 1939 of a theological work of the Cathars, late, it is true, the Book of the Two Principles, coming on top of the restoration of the New Testament and of rituals used by the heretics, enables us at the present day to understand generally and in a number of variations what were the dogmas of the, quote, Church of Love, end of quote, as the heresy is sometimes called, although known mostly as the Albigensian heresy. Underlying the attitude of the Cathars, or more generally underlying dualism, there has ever been, alike in the most various religions and in the minds of millions of individual men, the problem of evil. Evil as the spiritually minded man experiences it in the world, and of course that problem is one always tragically present. To the problem of evil, Christianity offers an answer at once dialectical and paradoxical. It is an answer summed up in the two words freedom and grace. More pessimistic and more solidly logical, dualism declares good and evil to exist in absolute heterogeneity. There are two worlds and two creations. In effect, God is love, but the world is evil. Hence, God cannot be the creator of the world, of its darkness, and of the sin which coils itself about us. His creation was first spiritual and then one of the souls. It was completed and also perverted in the material order by the rebel angel, the great arrogant, the demiurge. That is to say, by Lucifer, or Satan. The latter tempted the souls or angels, saying, quote, "It is better to be down below, where you will be able to do both good and evil, than up above, where God allows you only to do good." The better to seduce souls, Lucifer showed them a woman of dazzling beauty who inflamed them with desire. Then he left heaven with her in order to descend into matter and into sensible manifestation. I'm going to reread that. To the problem of evil, Christianity offers an answer that once dialectical and To the problem of evil, Christianity offers an answer at once dialectical and paradoxical. It is an answer summed up in the two words freedom and grace. More pessimistic and more solidly logical, dualism declares good and evil to exist in absolute heterogeneity. There are two worlds and two creations. In effect, God is love, but the world is evil. Hence, God cannot be the creator of the world, of its darkness, and of the sin which coils itself about us. His creation was first spiritual, and then one of souls. It was completed and also perverted in the material order by the rebel angel, the great arrogant, the demiurge, that is to say, by Lucifer, or Satan. The latter tempted the souls or angels, saying, quote, "It is better to be down below where you will be able to do both good and evil than up above where God allows you only to do good." The better, and that's a footnote number 4. The Catharist prayer quoted by Döllinger. It should be noted that man's freedom, the faculty to do either evil or good, would thus have originated not in God, but in the devil. The better to seduce souls, Lucifer showed them, quote, "a woman of dazzling beauty who inflamed them with desire." Then he left heaven with her in order to descend into matter and into sensible manifestation. The angel souls, having followed Satan and the woman of dazzling beauty, were ensnared in material bodies, even though these were and remained foreign to them. This notion strikes me as throwing light upon a fundamental human sentiment or feeling, one that is still met with nowadays. A soul is then parted from its spirit, which remains in heaven. Tempted by the prospect of freedom, a soul actually becomes the prisoner of a body with terrestrial appetites and subject to the laws of procreation and death. But Christ came among us to show the way back to the light. The dualist Christ, like that of the Gnostics and of Mainz, was not really incarnated, he but took the appearance of a man. Such is the great Docetist heresy, Docetist from the Greek apparition, which from Marcion to our own day expresses our quite natural refusal to countenance the scandal of a man-god. The Cathars therefore rejected the dogma of the Incarnation and a fortiori its Roman translation in the sacrament of the Mass. They replaced it with a supper of brotherhood, which symbolized purely spiritual events. They also rejected baptism by water and recognized only baptism by the consolatory spirit. The consolmentum was the major rite of their church. It was given at initiation ceremonies to brethren who undertook to renounce the world and solemnly promised to devote themselves to God alone, never to lie or take an oath, never to kill or eat of an animal, and finally, ever to abstain, if married, from all contact with a wife. It seems that initiation was preceded by a fast of 40 days. Footnote number 1. The number 40 is archetypal. Jesus was 40 days in the wilderness. The Hebrews wandered for 40 days between Egypt and the Promised Land. The flood was brought about by a rainfall that lasted 40 days. In Buddhist Tantrism, the service of the woman is broken up into trials of ordeals of 40 days, etc., etc. 40 is the number for an ordeal or trial. It seems that initiation was preceded by a fast of 40 days and that another of the same length followed. Later in the 13th century, the ritual fast, or endura, was to result in the voluntary death of some of the pure, death for the love of God, the consummation of supreme detachment from any material law. The consolamentum was administered by bishops and included the imposition of hands amid a circle of the pure, and then the kiss of peace was exchanged by the brethren. Thereupon the fresh initiate became an object of veneration for ordinary believers who had not yet been consoled. He was entitled to their salute, that is to say, to 3 bows. I have mentioned the part assigned to woman as the devil's lure to draw souls down into bodies. In return, one might say, in order to get even, a feminine principle held to have pre-existed material creation occupied in Catharism an analogous part to that of the Sophia Pistis of Gnosticism. To the woman who was instrumental in the perdition of souls there corresponded Maria, symbol of the pure, saving light, intact, immaterial, mother of Jesus, and it would seem the all-gentle judge of released spirits. The Manichaeans had for centuries the same sacraments as the Cathars, the laying on of hands, the kiss of peace, and the veneration of the elect, or pure. It is important here to mention that Manichaean veneration is addressed to the, quote, form of light, end of quote, and that this represents in every man his own spirit, which has stayed in heaven beyond terrestrial manifestation, and welcomes the homage of his soul by a salute and a kiss. Hell, being the prison of matter, Lucifer, the rebel angel, can reign there only for the length of time that the error of souls persists. At the end of the cycle of their ordeals, comprising for men who have not yet been illumined several lives, physical and other, creation will return to the unity of the original spirit. The sinners borne off by Satan will be saved, and Satan himself will once again bow in obedience to the Most High. Catharist dualism issues in its eschatological monism, whereas our Christian orthodoxy, inasmuch as it decrees the eternal damnation of the devil and of hardened sinners, becomes ultimately dualistic, even though, contrary to Manichaeism, it professes the ideal of a single creation, accomplished entirely at the hands of the deity, and one that began by being entirely good. There is a final feature to be noted. As with so many Eastern religions and sects, Jainists, Buddhists, Essenes, and Gnostic Christians, the Catharist Church consisted of two groups, the perfect, perfecti, footnote 1. Incidentally, the name perfect is to be found nowhere but in the records of the Inquisition. The term good men, or more simply Christians, seems to have been used by the Cathars themselves, and perfect seems to have been ironical. The Catharist Church consisted of two groups, the perfect, perfecti, who had received the consolamentum, and the mere believers, credentes, or imperfecti. The latter alone were allowed to marry and to go on living in a world which the pure condemned, and this without having to comply with all the precepts of esoteric morality. Bodily mortifications, contempt for creation, the severance of all worldly ties. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, quoted by Ron, was able to say of the Cathars, notwithstanding that he fought them with all his might, quote, "No sermons are more thoroughly Christian than theirs, and their morals are pure," end of quote. His testimonial makes up to some extent for the slanders of the Inquisition. It is nevertheless odd to find a saint describing as Christian a form of preaching in which several of the fundamental dogmas of his church were rejected. As for the purity of the morals of the Cathars, it has just been shown that they professed beliefs entirely contrary to those upon which the Christian morality is based. The condemnation of the flesh, which is now viewed by some as characteristically Christian, is in fact of Manichaean and heretical origin. For it must be borne in mind that when St. Paul speaks of the flesh, he means not the physical body, but the whole of the unbelieving man. Body, mind, faculties, and desires, and hence his soul too. The Albigensian crusade, led by the abbot of Citeaux at the beginning of the 13th century, resulted in the destruction of the towns inhabited by the Cathars, and the burning of their books, the slaughter and burning of the mass of the people who loved them, and the violation of their sanctuaries and supreme high place, the famous castle of Montségur, the highly refined civilization of which they were the austere and secret spirit, was brutally devastated. Nevertheless, to that culture and its fundamental doctrines we still pay tribute. We are its debtors, as I hope to show, far more than we realize.